Rise and shine. It is on the whistle time. Hello and welcome to the On the Whistle podcast. My name is Ali Howorth. I'm here in Casablanca covering the Women's Africa Cup of Nations. And boy, did we have an absolute belter in the semi-finals. Here in Casablanca, the Super Falcons of Nigeria took on Banyana from South Africa. And it was, in many ways, an absolute classic. It had everything in this game: injuries, the goals, the controversial decisions, chaos. Let's get into it. I mean, coming into this game, the Super Falcons were on top of the world. They had all the momentum with them. They'd smashed Zambia 5-0 in the last round. They kind of had this sense of weight around this team, a sense of inevitability. They've got a decent support here. A few hundred fans who are an excellent voice both in the Zambia game and against South Africa. And on the flip side, Banyana have stumbled through this tournament. There's issues off the pitch. They're missing Tembi Khatlana, their star player. And then, even they were taken to penalties by not a very strong Senegal side. But even given that, they get through, they have to go to penalties. So they played an extra 30 minutes plus penalties compared to Nigeria. But Nigeria they played a day before. So they had a day's extra rest, which is a huge advantage in these kind of tournaments. I mean, bear in mind, I think in the women's Euros, not in WAFCON, but in the women's Euros, I heard the stat that no team has ever won the tournament who are on the second side of the bracket because they have a days less rest at every stage. So we're seeing that again. But on top of that, Banyana had to travel to Casablanca. So they've 2 less days to prepare. Nigeria were able to take a day off, have a full day's training, and then have their match day -1. Banyana didn't. They played that day that Nigeria were resting. Then they traveled the day Nigeria trained, and then they had the match day -1. So they didn't have any rest, and they didn't have a proper training session. So coming into this, the Super Falcons were heavy favorites, and straight off the whistle, really, they just hammered South Africa, and it looked like it could be this ugly result where the Super Falcons run away with it, like they did against Zambia, where they scored after just a minute or two. They pushed, right on they had a free kick in the first minute, ball over the top that Dlamini doesn't deal with it, and almost leads to a Nigeria goal. Echegini comes really close a few minutes later from the edge of the box when Esther Okoronkwo chested down. Then when Okoronkwo herself is played through on goal, 10 minutes later, Dlamini makes a good save, and then Titsetso Makubela makes a brilliant double goal line clearance to stop the Okoronkwo from scoring. It just looked like Nigeria were just going to smash South Africa. But one thing I've noticed in this tournament is with Nigeria is they come out flying out of the box, and they've played 4 games up to this point before the Banyana game. 2 of them were a 0-0 and a 1-0, which they needed a last-minute winner to win against Botswana and Algeria. And the other 2 were 3-0 against Tunisia and a 5-0 against Zambia. So super emphatic or super goal-shy. And the 2 games where they scored a lot of goals against Tunisia and against Zambia, they scored set-piece goals within the first 4 minutes in both of those games. And so I knew coming into this game, there was this idea that they're going to come flying out. If South Africa can survive those first few minutes, we've got a game on our hands. If they don't, if Nigeria score, the game's done, because they're such a strong defensive unit. They're so happy to play on the break. It just, everything flows in their favor. And so it felt like that was like, oh my goodness, Nigeria are about to, open the floodgates, boom, boom, boom. South Africa held strong, and that's where I want to give full credit to South Africa and Desiree Ellis and her players, because this team, no matter what the issues they have off the pitch, they've not been paid. Desiree Ellis doesn't have a contract, et cetera. They have the mentality of champions. They are defensively resolute. They ride out these difficult moments, and they did that against Nigeria. And after that first 10, 15-minute spell, they grew into the game. Yes, they didn't have many ideas up front at first. Seopa Sen was kind of doing a lot of work by herself, didn't have a lot of support. Hilda Magai, who was the star of the last WAFCON in many ways and in the World Cup, has been struggling with injury, and she didn't start this game. She did come on quite early, though, for Makubela, who then was injured. So again, it was all this, Makubela is then injured. Lamini went down a couple times, looked like she might get subbed off. Everything looked in Nigeria's favor, but Banyana rode that out. They rode it out, and as the half wore on, we started to see, okay, this is the magic that this team can play. The short, triangles, the flowing movement, the wing backs overlapping, and Refiwe Jane in particular was superb. She's just such a classy operator in that kind of pivot role in front of the defense. But and so again, despite the difference in terms of rest and legs. It felt like the longer this game goes on, Nigeria, they feel the pressure, they struggle to deal with it, and it becomes Banyana's game. It becomes their game to win. And then right on the stroke of halftime, like I think 43rd, 44th minute, Nigeria get a penalty, and it is so harsh. It was a cross, and I think it's Ijamalusi who crosses it, and she's like half a meter away from Bambanani Mbane. Her hand is out, yes, but it is so close and to her body. Like they are physically so close to each other. Referee gives a penalty, and Rashida Ajibade scores. Dlamini came close to saving it, but she scores. And then again, it's that sense of, okay, this is it. Second half, Nigeria are going to come out flying again. They're going to come out and hammer South Africa. And it didn't really materialize. South Africa grew into the game. Hilda Magaya was excellent coming off the bench. She kind of brought this impetus, this pace, this directness that Nigeria kind of hadn't really had to deal with yet, because against Zambia, all that it came from was long balls to Barbara Banda and Kundananji. Whereas suddenly with Banyana, they can play a bit. They can play through the lines. They can keep the ball on the deck. And that's exactly what happened when they scored, is in the 60th minute. Brilliant give and go from Magaya. Ball up to Magaya, back heel into Jane. Jane slips her through, away she goes, and Osinachi Ohale with kind of a very bizarre pullback of her. It's just so obvious in the press box. You could just see Magaya ghosts into the penalty box. She reaches out, grabs her, pulls her back, penalty. And there is no one better in penalties, in my opinion, in African football than Linda Motlado. Just cool, the coolest cucumber in the stadium, slots at home. And suddenly, Banyana were on top. Nigeria, they had lost all that momentum. In that first 20, 30 minutes, Ihezuo and Okoronkwo were just absolutely hammering South Africa. And you felt like, oh my goodness, like Fikile Magama, this tiny right back, just cannot physically compete with the Nigerians. But then, Banyana, they grew into it. They started to control the game. They started to see a lot more of the ball. You saw it in the Nigerian players. Like Rashida Ajibade had for a solid 30 seconds, had this big argument with, I think it was Demahin and Hiezuho. They were all arguing, yelling at each other. The fans suddenly, at halftime, they were chanting Madugu, Madugu for the coach. They were, in party mode. They had Afro beats playing. But you couldn't hear it because they were dancing and cheering. Suddenly in the second half, you could hear all the music. You could hear it all because no one was chanting, no one was excited. There's, even the journalists sat with us. The Nigerian journalists are very much fans as well as journalists, and they were suddenly yelling, kind of like in stress and anxiety. And suddenly South Africa, you could see it just wasn't bothering them. They were a lot calmer on the ball. They were a lot cooler, and the game felt like it was moving towards in their direction. Seopa Senwe and Magaya both kind of had carved out chances. Again, they weren't creating anything clear cut, but they were the better side. They were on top. And then what we have to talk about is what happened then in the 83rd minute, which is it looks like this game is petering out. There's neither team looks like they're really wanting to give a proper go of it, where it looks like we're heading towards extra time. And then suddenly, very innocuously, off a free kick for Nigeria in the South Africa box, Gabriela Salgado goes down screaming, and instantly, every single player around her reacts in horror. Like the Nigerian players, all their hands go to their head. Kind of Ashley Plumter kind of immediately turns around in shock, and all the South African players, so many of them immediately out, even more so, hands on heads, screaming, crying, running away. Hilda Magai ran all the way 60 meters from the box, all the way to the South African bench to essentially, and I wasn't sure at first what happened because she ran over and you almost thought is she injured? Is she looking for some water or quickly to get some, tape or something like that? And no, she's in floods of tears. One of the coaches goes out and gives her a big hug. Caitlin Swart, the substitute goalkeeper, who's very good friends with Gabriela Salgado, is in floods of tears. And it's just, we spend the next, 6 to 10 minutes waiting to see what's happening, and then medical staff go out. She's eventually brought off on a stretcher, and her leg is strapped up. And after the game, Rashida told us that it was her shin, and it's been really hard to actually find out what's happened. We haven't had any updates from the South African camp except since they said she's in hospital being treated for a serious leg injury. But it was clearly incredibly gruesome. I've never seen players react to something like that. Every single one, Chiamaka Nnadozie was in floods of tears, Demahin was, everyone. And it was just this horrible moment of, you realize that, there's you almost forget about the football because it becomes irrelevant. With a Danish colleague, Booster, and he's talking about the same thing happening with Christian Eriksen. Obviously, we at the moment we assumed, and she is fine, is in terms of Gabriela Salgado's not dying, but it was horrifying, and it was this kind of terrible moment, and eventually she's brought off on the stretcher, and essentially the players have to huddle up, say a quick prayer, motivate each other, and go back out and play. And a big part of me thinks, on reflection, like, why didn't CAF step in, the referee, the match commissioner, anyone to step in and say, look, can we continue? We have to ask that question. Are these players in a fit state of mind to play? Because they clearly were not. I mean, they then restart the game, and the South African players are still in tears. They're still, their heads are not in the game. And to their credit, they almost scored again with the Sinoxolo Sasane almost scoring a lovely cross into the box, and she actually beat Nadozie, but was cleared off the line. And then in the 94th minute, 96, which again, I don't know how there was only 6 minutes added on, Michelle Alozier's deep cross floats in. Ijama Lucy goes for it, or sorry, Deborah Abiodun goes for it. Everyone misses it. It bounces into the goal, and Nigeria have won. And suddenly, but it was just this strange experience of then the final whistle happens and the Nigerians are all kind of, there's this simultaneous ecstasy of them qualifying for the final, and you could see how much it meant for them, but also collapsing in tears, and the South African players just all collapsed as well. And Rashida Ajibade couldn't even do her flash interview on the pitch because she was hunched over, like holding her man of the match or player of the match award in tears, and couldn't do the interview. It was just weird, this strange moment that kind of goes beyond football and sport of like, what are we doing here? Like, trying to play this game, it almost feels like a kind of a sham. But yeah, so Nigeria are into the final. Having said all that, Gabriela, from what we've heard, is fine. She's stable. I think they'll be going back to South Africa today, where I think she'll have to have, well, presumably surgery and see what happens there with her recovery. But it's horrible, particularly for her, because she missed the last WAFCON right on the verge of the tournament. She got injured, so she actually missed it. So she would have been a part of the team, but she doesn't have a medal. So, and Desiree Ellis spoke about that after the game in the press conference, that because in WAFCON we have a third place playoff. She's saying this game, all it is about is getting Gabriela a medal, because for us that's what matters the most now, is getting her a medal. But yeah, so it's a crazy game. Nigeria into the final, and like, you have to think that they'll be favorites. Obviously, they're up against Morocco at home, but this Nigeria team, there is something special. They talk about Mission X, they talk about, winning their 10th title, but they genuinely, there is something very powerful about this team, the way they pull together, despite all the challenges, despite the kind of inadequacies of what's going on behind them in terms of them being paid. They don't even have a proper coach, because Maduka's not even, he's an interim coach. He's not got a contract. But they've got such a strong unit. They've got so much depth, and they've been able to rotate in a way that no other team has been able to. And you just feel like the momentum is with them. Now, there's also a huge amount of motivation for the Super Falcons team, because when I spoke to them ahead of the game, particularly the tournament, I remember speaking to Ashley Plumpton, and she's saying, look, we all agree there's one team we want to play, and that's Morocco. And that's because in 2022, Morocco were the ones who knocked out Nigeria, went to penalties in that heated game in the semi-finals. What a game, one of the best games I've ever covered. Obviously, in that game, Nigeria got 2 sendings off. Ajibade was one of them, and both of those red cards, the Super Falcons feel were very harsh and feel like they were, I think not the Super Falcons themselves, but elements of the Nigerian media and public would, point to the fact that Morocco were hosting the tournament and got 2 very kind of controversial decisions going their way. Now, if memory serves, I actually thought that both the red cards were harsh, but were fair. I think particularly Ajibade's, where she kind of steps over the ball to protect it, but it's one of those where very Paul Pogba in my mind, where she steps over the ball to protect it, but actually stamps on someone, which is a red card. But they have so much motivation. There is a lot of energy in this team, but they have to come up against the host Morocco. And Morocco, on the flip side, were not in good shape against Ghana. They're missing Fatima Tagna, who's injured now, and I think will miss the final as well, which is a big loss. Jorge Vilda brought in Elodie Nakash instead of Najat Badri to make up that. And Ghana just, I've got to preface this, I wasn't at the game, so I can't give as good analysis as the first one, but Ghana were so much better than Morocco, particularly in that first half. They created a lot of chances. Boye Lorca looked really, really good. Princess Marfo had a really good chance, and they took the lead very much with the run of play. off a corner, great header off the Khadija Amrichi actually made a brilliant save for the first header, but then it's tapped in, and Morocco really labored. Now eventually they get back into it. Ibsen Jaidi into Wazraoui Dickey, who then finishes, and they go to penalties. And that's the one thing I will say with this Morocco team is they are full of good penalty takers. Jaidi, Wazraoui Dickey, Msoudi, Shabak, and Mrabat, who wasn't on the pitch at the time, but is their first choice penalty taker. And they go through on penalties against Ghana. It was a really good game, to be fair, and you kind of feel really heartbroken for Ghana because Lars Kim Bjorgen has done so well to come into this team that was at a complete loss in free fall after Nora Hoptel left, genuinely all over the place. But he's revitalized them, took them to the semi-final, which no one expected back in Ghana. This is a huge boost, and some really big names have come through this tournament as youngsters. Yaboa, Nyameche, out to Alice Kusi, who's a bit older, but this is a team that has quite a good future ahead of them, and it's such a shame because Comfort Yaboa is the one who missed the final penalty, only 18, right back. She's been brilliant at this tournament, and it's tremendously harsh that she had to suffer the kind of the weight of that moment. But looking towards the final, it's going to be a banger. Nigeria coming into Morocco, there is bad blood. There's so much motivation from both sides. Morocco desperate to get their first ever title. Nigeria desperate to get that 10th and to get revenge over Morocco. The Olympic Stadium in Rabat was roaring in that semi-final. It will be even more so in the final. I think it's going to be an attritional game. It's going to be a physical game. I think Nigeria, for me, are the slight favorites. Again, they're going to come out strong. They're going to come out fast. If they can get a goal early, they are so good defensively, so resilient. But Morocco, have a complete side. And unlike South Africa, once they get into the final third, they have the creative ideas. They have the creativity in Shebak, in Wazraoui Dickey, even Msoudi, who I think struggles physically, but is such a brilliant talent. And of course, Ibtasim Jaidi is an excellent finisher. So I think it's going to be a very tight game. I think Nigeria are probably my slight favorites, just because I think there's so much good momentum behind this team. But we will be there. We will do a pod afterwards, and we cannot wait.